Trying to plan the next story arc of your campaign? Wondering how to make it appropriate to the levels of the player characters? Well then, you're in the right place. Today, we're going to talk about using tiers to help plan your story arcs and campaigns. I'm JW the DM, and welcome to my channel. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and put that bell icon at all. First, let's go over a few basic concepts that are key to understanding how to do this. The first is, of course, a tier. In case you don't know what tiers are in 5e games in general, each tier is based on what level the player's characters are. Tiers are used to determine what types of and what scope, not scale, of adventures and threats a party should be encountering. There are 4 tiers, and in Dungeons & Dragons, they have names that really give you all you'll need to know as prompts once you're familiar with them. They go like this. Character levels 1 to 4 make up Tier 1, called Local Heroes. Character levels 5 to 10 are Tier 2, Heroes of the Realm. Levels 11 through 16, Tier 3, Masters of the Realm. And 17 through 20, Tier 4, Masters of the World. Now don't take the names of those levels literally, but do think of what those names imply for threat levels and obstacles met by the characters that are that powerful. The next concept, and forgive me my well-experienced DMs, is the concept of adventure hooks. Hooks are situations or things or suggestions or rumors or job boards or quests from a quest giver that the PCs and thereby the players get latched onto to want to start doing a quest or adventure. A hook gets things started. If the characters are approached by a wizened old lady in a long, tattered, hooded cloak, and she asks the party to find her late wife's sword that was passed down 4 generations, well, that's a hook. Like a fishing hook, the hook needs to be well baited for the players and their PCs to want to bite. So you'll need to make sure the promise of what the adventure might be or the rewards thereof will make one juicy worm. Hooks are also important for keeping things moving forward. One quest ends and another begins. It's even better if hooks to the following quest are dropped in the current quest. Now, there's very little chance that you all haven't been exposed to this concept. Sequels versus a series. You probably know this, but let me quickly spell it out. A sequel is a self-contained story arc that, while somewhat self-contained, is part of a larger complete story that started in an earlier place. Think of the original Star Wars trilogy. Each movie was self-contained, but they all described Luke's journey from accepting his call to adventure right through to the end of Return of the Jedi when the Emperor is finally defeated. A series, on the other hand, not a mini-series, is a set of self-contained stories that, for the most part, aren't reliant on a greater story to be told. Some series do, in fact, have overarching plot going through the episodes, but still, each episode can be watched on its own without having seen the other episodes before it or seeing any recaps. You can enjoy them without paying attention to the greater narrative. Miniseries and shows like The Last of Us have most of their episodes used more like sequels than old-fashioned series. I say most episodes because you have things like in The Last of Us, the love story episode of the Prepper and the Survivor. That was a great bit of television, by the way. That, while connected to the rest of the story, could be enjoyed just as much viewed on its own. So, as you can tell, series and sequels are not mutually exclusive. You can still have a strong element of overarching plot, or sequels can feel very episodic. In fact, Star Wars called each of the saga movies an episode, so we can combine these. And yes, this concept will come up in just like 30 seconds. The last concept, and this will be quick, is the idea of scope rather than scale. Moving through the tiers may or may not involve increasing scale. More monsters, more kingdoms involved, more. Unfortunately, scope and scale can largely be mixed around, and scale can measure degree as well as number, but for my purposes today, I'm using scale more for number and size, while using scope for degree. All right, that's it for that. Now we get to the good parts. There are 3 non-exclusive to the others ways that tiers can be applied to campaigns. 1, telling one grand dedicated story. Excuse me while I itch my nose. Number 2, telling many episodic stories connected mainly through the PCs. And 3, doing both. Maybe a tier or 2 is one type and another tier or 2 as the other. So basically, is each tier a sequel or maybe a season of The Last of Us, or is it a mostly series-like episodic show with the occasional movie sequel focusing on the grand connecting narrative? To my older audience, I'd like to point out that The X-Files had episodes both series-like and sequel-like, and one of the movies was more of a sequel and the other wasn't so much. They famously had 3 types of TV episodes: comedic, monster, and greater narrative. The first 2 were series-like and the last sequels-like. Here's an example of telling separate stories for each tier, using the tiers to direct how we structure things straight from a campaign I'm currently running. Now, because I absolutely adore this mini campaign starter set, I began with the Lost Mine of Phandelver for the however manyth time that I've run it. That adventure runs you all the way through Tier 1. When it ends, you get promoted to level 5 and start your story, your next adventure in Tier 2. The story, much like the D&D name for the tier, Local Heroes, is centered around a mining village called Phandalin. Some chapters, essentially like episodes, take place a day's travel from Phandalin. Some are a couple of days' travel from Phandalin, but Phandalin is the center of it all, even though even the climax happens about a day's travel to the east in a place called Waveko Cave, or Phandelver, Last Mines of Phandelver, as stated in the title. The nifty mini-campaign has several chapters that act like TV episodes in a mini-series. They are all more like sequels to each other than fully episodic. And this first tier acts as a season of that show. The scope is smallish. There are smallish groups of goblins and then bandits and such. There's a dragon to be encountered at about level 3 because it's a starter set and WotC always wants new players to get both dungeons and dragons. Anyway, the PCs are increasingly discovering there's a plot from the mini BBEG, or Big Bad Evil Guy or Gal, to get their hands on the Forge of Spells in the Phandelver mine, and he's exerting his influence on Phandalin to help make this happen. So, Tier 1, Local Heroes. The PCs save the village of Phandalin from the BBEG, stop the BBEG from discovering how to use the Forge of Spells, and make it safe for people to travel to Phandalin again. Small scope. It doesn't include kingdoms or nation states. The villains are relatively low threat, and it's a completed story. Although it does have the potential to go into Tier 2 seamlessly. What if Tier 1's bad guy was actually working for someone else? But we didn't do this. We left it as a single story told within that tier. It happened within one season of a sequel-type TV miniseries. The only story things moving forward into the next tier were personal to the characters. The next tier was spent in Waterdeep, in the Dungeon of the Mad Mage. We justified why these good guy PCs would want to head down into the dungeon so that they'd follow the published module through to the next 3 tiers, but something happened along the way. The scope increased, yes. When there were less threatening creatures, there were more of them. On the whole, creatures were more threatening. There was a lot of diplomacy between the PCs and potential enemies, entire communities of potential enemies, turning some into allies. Now, I'm not a fan of Dungeon of the Mad Mage now that I've run some of it. It doesn't do a good job justifying why the characters would bother traveling through the dungeon if their motives were more to do good than to just chase adventure and treasure. My players felt that way too, so we set up a plot line of stopping a major threat, the Xanathar and his guild, from doing a slave sale and then getting rid of the threat of Xanathar permanently. It took the remainder of Tier 2 to do this. Hooks were planted early because the Xanathar guild already had a presence on the first levels of the dungeon. The scope was greater, the intrigue greater, the resourcefulness of the PCs needed to be greater, and they were helping an entire city-state, Waterdeep, as well as surrounding areas, rather than just a small mining town. They even had to deal with the small army. Resourcefulness played into things as much as combat did, and the BBEG, the Xanathar, was much more terrifying than the boss of Tier 1. The plot was largely homebrewed based on the module, but everyone wanted out of that dungeon, including me, so Tier 3 was going to be something completely different. It was time not to save a village or a nation, but now, the world. I won't go too much into the plot here because we're about halfway through this tier, and some of my players watch these videos. Suffice to say, the moment you make saving the world from a great threat the issue, you've significantly increased the scope of the campaign. But notice, before I go into that, notice that the prior two tiers each dealt with a tier-specific level of threat. In the first case, there was narrative room to turn this into more of a sequel tier advancement, but we chose to do a separate overall adventure for each of those two tiers. Tiers, based on the abilities the characters have within them, make natural places to end major story arcs and introduce a new level of threat and mystery. For Tier 3, one of the PCs was constantly being targeted to be kidnapped and now is targeted just to be killed. Yes, I have backup plans for keeping the story moving in case that character dies. Never base a plot on a single character without knowing how to keep the other characters engaged if the central one dies. There are many quests to follow and legendary threats. By the end of the tier, at level 16 or so, the PCs will be facing an entity that is practically a god, assuming they make it that far. Currently, the plan is to have that be the end of the campaign. However, there were plans to extend the campaign through Tier 4 based on another character's background, whereby the events of Tier 3 were only a setup to an even larger threat with an even bigger BBEG, a full-on invasion from other worlds, and a more complex and flexible plan for the bad guys to succeed. However, that character left the building, and to be honest, I want to get back to lower level campaigns. But this would have made Tier 4 a sequel to Tier 3. If you sat through that example, you should have a pretty decent idea of how to apply tiers to campaigns. But here's a quick recap. 1. You can use each tier as a single overarching mini-story. The challenges intended for that tier are fairly uniform and appropriate to that tier. 2. Because things change substantially from tier to tier in the game, each tier makes a logical stopping point for any semi-major plot stories. Think of a TV miniseries or a movie sequel. 3. Some tiers can be standalone and not greatly affect what happens in later tiers, except for ongoing personal stories of the PCs. And 4. There are plenty of times when 2 or more tiers, sometimes all of them, are part of one gigantic story, as so many published D&D adventure modules do. With that statement about adventure modules, know that many tables start these darn things but never finish them. If things can stay on track enough to continue the adventure, fantastic, but be flexible in case something better comes up. Ooh, I haven't touched on hooks yet. Generally speaking, when you have a clue about what the next tier might be about, start to bait and set hooks for that next tier. For example, I was baiting hooks for Tier 4 even while in Tier 2. The character left the building, of course, at the end of Tier 2, so I didn't wind up using the hooks in... oh well. 3. I was dropping hooks for Tier 3 from almost the time that the character that's the center of it joined the party in the middle of Tier 2. That player was playing another character that died. And when she created this new character, her backstory and description were just too juicy not to use. I don't even know if the players noticed the hooks, but they sank in. By the time stuff started happening at the beginning of Tier 3, it was off to the races. Drop hooks early and often. That way, new plot lines don't come from nowhere, and the story, whether loose and series-like or sequel-like, doesn't seem to come out of nowhere. It also lets you judge whether the players are interested in going in a certain direction, which can inform you where to take the potential plot. If they don't take the bait for something and you've presented a couple hooks with that bait, stop trying with that bait and hook the offer up with bait for a different potential plot. Which leads me to say, even if you've plotted a campaign across all 4 tiers, be ready to throw some or all of it out and plan anew the general plot for later tiers. You never know what the players and their PCs will do and what will snag their interest. So you have to be flexible and be willing to let go of whatever isn't working for them. Sometimes that's nothing. Sometimes that's everything. That's DMing for you. You know, it's part of the fun and part of the challenge if you can accept it. I think I've covered all the main stuff. If you have any questions, please put them in the comments and I'll do my best to reply to them. A quick shout out to Miss Inkalot and Mr. Vincent for some input on the script. Thank you. Much appreciated, you two. Once again, don't forget to like, subscribe, and set notifications for all. And as always, may all your games be full of glory. Till next time.